Chapter 1: Death and Rebirth. Cold rain fell on the empty road as headlights flashed through the darkness. The girl ran across the street while holding her phone, laughing at a message from her friend. She didn't see the truck until the loud horn exploded in her ears. Everything turned white. For a moment there was no sound, no pain, no body. Then darkness swallowed everything. When she opened her eyes again, she expected a hospital ceiling or maybe an afterlife. Instead, she saw trees. Tall trees, endless green leaves, a bright sky above her. She blinked slowly. Where am I? Her voice didn't come out. Instead, yips, a small animal sound escaped her mouth. She froze. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her body was small, covered in white fur. A fluffy tail moved behind her. She stared at her reflection in a puddle of water beside her. A tiny white fox stared back. What? She screamed internally. I'm a fox. Her mind raced. Did I reincarnate? She tried to stand up, wobbling on 4 legs. Her balance was terrible at first, but after a few attempts, she managed to walk. The forest around her was quiet. Birds chirped in the distance. Wind rustled the leaves. Everything felt incredibly real. After wandering for hours, exhaustion hit her. She curled up under a tree. Her mind slowly began connecting the pieces. Reincarnation. Fantasy world. Small fox body. But something still felt strange. She had the strong feeling she recognized this world. As she drifted into sleep, she whispered to herself, "Where did I end up?" Chapter 2: A Familiar Story. The next morning she woke up starving. Real fox instincts kicked in. She sniffed the air. The forest smelled full of life, animals, grass, and water. But hunting was difficult. After failing to catch several small animals, she collapsed beside a river. While drinking water, she suddenly froze. In the reflection of the river, something appeared behind her. A large noble carriage rolled along a road near the forest. Horses pulled it slowly. Soldiers rode beside it. Curiosity pulled her closer. She hid behind bushes near the road. Suddenly, bandits jumped from the forest. Attack the carriage. Chaos exploded. Swords clashed. Horses screamed. The fox watched everything with wide eyes. Then the carriage door opened. A young noble girl stepped out. She had long silver hair and cold violet eyes. Her posture was elegant and proud. The fox's heart stopped. I know her. Her mind searched frantically. Then the realization struck like lightning. Seraphina Valmont. The Villainess. This world. It was the novel she once read. The story where Seraphina eventually loses everything. Her family would be destroyed. Her reputation ruined. And in the end, she would die alone in a burning mansion. The fox stared at the young girl, standing calmly in the middle of the battlefield. But something felt wrong. Seraphina looked much younger than in the novel. Maybe this was the beginning of the story. That meant her tragic fate hadn't happened yet. The fox's chest tightened. She whispered softly, "So this is the world. And that girl's was the villainess destined to die." Chapter 3: The Lonely Noble Girl. The bandits were quickly defeated by the soldiers. Seraphina calmly returned to her carriage. The fox secretly followed from a distance. Hours later, the carriage stopped in front of a massive mansion. This was the Valmont estate. The fox hid in the garden bushes. She watched Seraphina walk inside the mansion. Servants bowed politely. Everything looked perfect. But later that night, something unexpected happened. Seraphina returned to the garden alone. She wore simple clothes instead of noble dresses. Her expression looked tired. The fox watched silently. Seraphina sat on a stone bench under the moonlight. For a long time, she didn't move. Then she whispered quietly to herself, "No one understands." The fox felt something heavy in her chest. In the novel, Seraphina was always described as arrogant and cruel, but the girl sitting there now looked lonely. After a moment, Seraphina noticed movement in the bushes. Their eyes met. The fox froze. Seraphina stared quietly. Instead of shouting or calling guards, she slowly placed a piece of meat on the ground. Then she stood up and walked away. The fox stared at the food, confused. "For me." Slowly she approached. The meat smelled delicious. She ate it quickly. When she looked up again, Seraphina was watching from the balcony window. Their eyes met again. For a brief moment, Seraphina smiled. A small, gentle smile no one else could see. Chapter 4: Snow the Fox. After that night, the fox returned every evening. Seraphina always left food in the garden. Sometimes meat, sometimes fruit. Eventually, the fox grew brave enough to approach closer. One evening Seraphina sat quietly on the bench. The fox walked toward her carefully. Seraphina didn't move. When the fox reached her feet, Seraphina slowly reached out her hand. Her fingers gently touched the fox's head. Warm, soft. The fox froze. Seraphina whispered softly, "You're braves." Her voice was calm and gentle. No one in the mansion had ever heard her speak like that. From that day onward, Seraphina secretly kept the fox. She gave her a name, Snow. The fox didn't hate the name. In fact, she liked it, because it was the first thing Seraphina had ever given her. Chapter 5, The Tragic Future. Days turned into weeks. Snow stayed beside Seraphina every day. She watched the noble mansion carefully, and slowly remembered the story of the novel. The tragedy would begin when Seraphina meets Prince Adrian. Then she would compete with the heroine Lily. Misunderstandings would pile up. Enemies would manipulate events. Eventually, the Valemont family would fall, and Seraphina would become the villainess everyone hated. Snow looked at the girl, reading quietly beside the window. Seraphina gently stroked her fur. "Snow, you're the only one who stays." Snow felt something painful in her chest. Seraphina had no idea what the future held, but Snow did. She whispered in her mind, "I won't let that happen." Even if she was just a fox, she would fight the story itself. She would change the villainess's fate. Autumn arrived quietly. The Valemont estate was busy preparing for the Imperial Noble Gathering, an event where powerful families gathered to discuss politics and alliances. Servants moved quickly through the halls. Carriages arrived one after another. Snow sat on the wide window ledge of Seraphina's room, watching the preparations outside. Her fox ears twitched nervously. She remembered this event. In the original story, this gathering introduced a dangerous character, a man feared by nobles, a man even the Emperor treated cautiously. Duke Kael Ravenheart. Snow's tail flicked anxiously. He was not the male lead. He was not the hero. He was someone far more unpredictable. In the novel, Kael was described as a cold and ruthless duke who ruled the northern lands. People whispered that he crushed rebellions without mercy and executed traitors personally. But there was something the novel never explained clearly. Why did he always protect Seraphina, even when she became the villainess? Even when the entire empire hated her, he never turned against her. Snow never understood that part of the story. And tonight, he would appear for the first time. Seraphina stood in front of a mirror, while maids adjusted her elegant silver dress. Her long hair flowed like moonlight down her back. She looked calm as always, but Snow noticed the small tension in her shoulders. Seraphina disliked social gatherings. Too many fake smiles, too many judging eyes. Snow jumped down from the window and walked toward her. Seraphina smiled softly. "Snow, are you worried about me?" She gently lifted the small fox into her arms. Snow rubbed her head against Seraphina's chest. If she could speak human words right now, she would scream, "Don't go." But Seraphina misunderstood her reaction. She laughed quietly. "You always get clingy before parties." Snow sighed internally. If only you knew. The noble gathering took place in a massive ballroom in the capital palace. Golden chandeliers illuminated the entire hall. Nobles in elegant clothes filled the room. Music echoed through the air. Snow hid inside Seraphina's cloak. Technically, animals were not allowed at noble events, but Seraphina had quietly brought Snow anyway. "Lady Seraphina." Several noble ladies greeted her politely. Their smiles were sweet, but Snow could smell their hostility. Seraphina returned their greetings calmly. Her expression remained cold and elegant. Snow peeked out slightly. Everything looked exactly like the beginning of the novel. Her heart started beating faster. When does he appear? Then suddenly, the ballroom doors opened. Silence spread across the hall. Heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Snow slowly turned her head and saw him, Duke Kael Ravenheart. He wore a long black coat embroidered with silver patterns. His dark hair fell slightly over his sharp eyes. His presence alone made the entire room feel colder. Nobles whispered nervously. Some avoided eye contact completely. Others bowed quickly. Kael walked through the hall without looking at anyone. His expression was calm but distant, as if none of the nobles around him mattered. Snow's fur stood on end. This guy is dangerous. But then something strange happened. Kael suddenly stopped walking. His eyes moved slowly across the crowd and landed directly on Seraphina. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Seraphina remained calm as always, but Snow noticed the tiny change in Kael's expression. It lasted only a second, but she clearly saw it. Interest. Kael resumed walking, and surprisingly, he stopped directly in front of Seraphina. The surrounding nobles immediately stepped back. No one wanted to stand between those two. Kael spoke in a deep, calm voice. Lady Seraphina Valmont. Seraphina bowed politely. Duke Ravenheart. Snow peeked from Seraphina's cloak and glared at him. Kael noticed instantly. His eyes shifted downward. He saw the tiny fox. For a moment, a faint smile appeared on his lips. You brought a fox to a noble gathering. Seraphina gently held Snow. She dislikes being alone. Kael studied the fox carefully. Snow felt as if his gaze was reading her mind. Then Kael spoke again. She looks intelligent. Snow froze. Wait, was that just a normal comment? Or did he suspect something? Seraphina calmly replied. She is my companion. Kael nodded slowly. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then suddenly, he turned and walked away. The surrounding nobles immediately began whispering. Snow's heart was racing. Something about that interaction felt wrong. Very wrong. Kael had only spoken a few words, but his attention had been completely focused on Seraphina. And that strange smile when he looked at the fox. Snow had a bad feeling. This man is not simple. Later that night, Seraphina returned to her mansion. She placed Snow gently on the bed. Snow immediately started pacing. Seraphina watched her curiously. You've been restless since the party. Snow stopped. She looked at Seraphina. Then she remembered something terrifying. In the novel, Duke Kael had always supported Seraphina, but no one ever knew why. And now Snow had seen the way he looked at her. That gaze was not curiosity. It was something far deeper, something far more dangerous. Snow slowly realized the truth. The villain of the story had been watching the Villainess from the beginning, and now he had finally appeared. The story was beginning to change, and Snow had no idea whether that change would save Seraphina or destroy her even faster. Chapter 7, The Duke Who Keeps Appearing. Snow didn't sleep that night. She stayed on the windowsill, watching the moonlight spread across the Valmont garden. Her mind was full of one person, Duke Kael Ravenheart. In the original story, he appeared rarely. When he did, chaos followed. He was powerful, unpredictable, and feared by everyone in the Empire. But something in Snow's memory bothered her. In the novel, Kael never harmed Seraphina, even when she became the Villainess, even when her reputation collapsed, even when her family fell from power. Kael had always stood on her side. Snow never understood why, but now she had seen the way he looked at her. That gaze wasn't casual interest. It was something much deeper, something dangerous. Snow flicked her tail nervously. I don't trust that man. Behind her, Seraphina was sleeping peacefully on the large bed. Moonlight touched her silver hair. She looked calm, but Snow knew how fragile her future really was. I will protect you, Snow whispered in her mind. Morning arrived quietly. Servants began their usual work around the mansion. Seraphina was reading documents in her study, while Snow lay across the table. Suddenly, a servant knocked on the door. My lady, a guest has arrived. Seraphina looked up. Who? The servant hesitated slightly. Duke Ravenheart. Snow immediately sat up. Her ears shot straight into the air. Already, Seraphina's expression didn't change, but Snow noticed her fingers pause slightly on the paper. Send him in. The door opened. Duke Kael walked inside calmly, as if he owned the entire mansion. Snow instantly stood between him and Seraphina. Her tiny body looked ridiculous compared to the tall Duke, but she still growled. Kael stopped walking. He looked down at the fox. Then he laughed quietly. A guard fox. Seraphina sighed softly. Snow. The fox ignored her and continued glaring. Kael crouched down slightly. Now his eyes were directly level with Snow's. His gaze was sharp. Snow felt like she was being examined. After a moment he spoke quietly. You understand me, don't you? Snow froze. Seraphina didn't notice anything unusual, but Snow's heart started pounding. Did he just test me? Kael stood up again. His attention shifted back to Seraphina. I came to discuss business with your father. Seraphina nodded calmly. He is in the council room. Kael turned toward the door, but before leaving, he glanced at Snow again. His lips curved slightly, and then he walked away. Snow stared at the closed door. That man definitely knows something. Later that afternoon, Snow wandered through the mansion hallways. Her instincts were screaming. She followed Kael's scent. Eventually, she reached the garden. Kael was standing alone under a tree. Snow stopped behind a bush. Why is he here? Before she could move, Kael spoke without turning around. You can come out. Snow froze. Kael sighed. I already know you're there. Slowly, Snow stepped out from the bush. Kael turned around. His eyes were calm but amused. You really are unusual. Snow stayed silent. Kael crouched again, so they were face to face. For a moment, he studied her carefully. Then he spoke quietly. "You're not an ordinary animal." Snow's heart dropped. Kael continued calmly. "Your eyes are human." Silence filled the garden. Snow realized something terrifying. This man had figured her out. Kael leaned slightly closer. "Don't worry." His voice was surprisingly gentle. "I won't expose you." Snow stared at him suspiciously. Kael's expression softened slightly. "You're protecting Seraphina." Snow's ears twitched. Kael looked toward the mansion windows, where Seraphina's room was located. "I am doing the same thing." Snow blinked. For the first time, she noticed something in his eyes. Not coldness, not cruelty, but something deeper. Something heavy, something that looked suspiciously like love. Kael spoke again. "I've watched her since we were children." Snow stared. Kael's voice remained calm but quiet. "She was always alone." Snow's tail stopped moving. Kael continued. "The world misunderstands her." For a moment, his expression turned dark. "And I hate this world for it." Snow realized something important. This man wasn't protecting Seraphina for political reasons. He wasn't manipulating her. He wasn't using her. He simply loved her, and had loved her for a very long time. Snow felt confused, because in the original story, Seraphina never knew. Kael stood up again. "Little fox." Snow looked up. Kael spoke calmly. "If you truly want to protect her." His eyes turned serious. "Then don't trust the story you remember." Snow froze. Kael turned and began walking away. Before disappearing through the garden gate, he added one final sentence. "Because this world has already started changing." Snow remained standing in the garden, her mind spinning. For the first time, she realized something terrifying. She had been trying to change the story. But maybe the story had already begun changing on its own. Chapter 8, The Fox Who Fights the Story. Snow sat under the large oak tree in the Valemont garden long after Duke Kael left. Her small fox brain was spinning with thoughts. The cool wind moved through the leaves above her, but her mind was far from calm. He knows. Duke Kael knew she wasn't a normal fox. Worse, he knew she was protecting Seraphina. Snow curled her fluffy tail around her body. In the original novel, Kael was mysterious. His actions were rarely explained. But now that she had met him face to face, Snow realized something terrifying. He was far more intelligent than the story ever described. That meant one thing. He could become either the greatest ally or the most dangerous enemy. Snow sighed. Why is this story getting more complicated? Inside the mansion, Seraphina sat at her desk reading reports. Snow quietly jumped onto the desk. Seraphina smiled softly. "You look troubled." Snow stared at her. Seraphina gently stroked the fox's head. "I wish you could talk." Snow almost choked. "If only you knew." Seraphina continued reading documents. "Tomorrow, there will be another gathering at the Royal Garden." Snow suddenly froze. Her ears stood straight up. Royal Garden Gathering. She remembered that event clearly. It was extremely important in the original story, because that was the day Seraphina would officially meet Lily, the female lead. And from that moment, misunderstandings between them would begin. Snow immediately started shaking her head. "No, no, no." Seraphina looked confused. "What's wrong?" Snow grabbed Seraphina's sleeve with her mouth and tried pulling her away from the desk. Seraphina laughed quietly. "Snow, what are you doing?" Snow kept pulling harder. Seraphina tilted her head. "Are you telling me not to go tomorrow?" Snow nodded aggressively. Seraphina blinked. Then she smiled slightly. "You're very dramatic today." Snow collapsed on the desk in defeat. "She's still going." The next afternoon, the royal garden was filled with nobles. Bright flowers decorated the entire park. Music played softly in the background. Snow sat hidden inside Seraphina's cloak again. Her entire body was tense. This is where it starts. Nobles greeted Seraphina politely as she walked through the garden paths. Everything seemed calm. Too calm. Then suddenly, a cheerful voice called out, "Lady Seraphina." Snow's heart dropped. She peeked out slightly. A young girl with warm golden hair approached. Her smile was bright and friendly. "Lily, the heroine." Snow's eyes widened. "This is bad." In the original story, this meeting led to a series of misunderstandings that slowly turned Seraphina into the villainess. Lily stopped in front of Seraphina. "I've heard so much about you." Seraphina gave a polite nod. "Lady Lily." Snow immediately began panicking. Stop talking, stop talking." But Lily continued happily. "I've always wanted to meet you." Snow needed to stop this. Now, her fox brain worked quickly. Then, She jumped out of Seraphina's cloak, right onto the tea table. The table flipped. Teacups crashed everywhere. Tea splashed onto expensive dresses. Nobles screamed in shock. "What is that? My dress. Who brought a fox?" Chaos exploded in the royal garden. Snow ran wildly across the tables, knocking over everything. Flowers flew. Chairs collapsed. Someone slipped on spilled tea. Within seconds, the peaceful gathering turned into a complete disaster. Seraphina stood frozen. Lily looked stunned. And Snow sprinted directly back into Seraphina's arms. Seraphina stared at the destruction around her. Then she looked down at Snow. "You caused this, didn't you?" Snow blinked innocently. Seraphina sighed. The royal garden gathering was immediately cancelled. Snow felt proud. Mission accomplished. Seraphina never spoke properly with Lily. The event was completely ruined. The original story had been successfully interrupted. Later that evening, Seraphina returned home. She placed Snow on the bed and crossed her arms. "You owe me an explanation." Snow tilted her head. Seraphina sighed. "You destroyed an entire royal event." Snow wagged her tail happily. Seraphina rubbed her forehead. "I don't know why you did that." She paused. Then she gently patted Snow's head. But strangely, a small smile appeared on her lips. "I'm glad you did." Snow blinked. Seraphina looked out the window. "That girl made me uncomfortable." Snow's eyes widened. "Wait, really?" Seraphina continued softly. "She was too friendly." Snow realized something surprising. Seraphina's instincts had already sensed the danger. Maybe. The story was already changing. But just as Snow relaxed, a familiar voice suddenly spoke from the balcony. "You destroyed the royal garden." Snow's fur stood up instantly. Seraphina turned toward the balcony. Duke Kael stood there casually, as if climbing noble mansion balconies at night was completely normal. Snow jumped in front of Seraphina immediately. Kael looked down at the fox. Then he chuckled quietly. "That fox is far more dangerous than the Empire's enemies." Snow glared at him. Kael looked at Seraphina calmly. "You should keep her close." Seraphina sighed. "I already do." Kael nodded. Then he added quietly, "Because someone is watching you." The room suddenly felt colder. Snow's instincts screamed again. The story wasn't just changing. Something else had started moving in the shadows. And this time, even Snow didn't know what would happen next. Chapter 9, Someone Watching the Villainess. The room became silent after Duke Kael's warning. Seraphina stood near the window, her silver hair glowing softly in the moonlight. Snow stood in front of her protectively, her tiny body tense. Kael leaned casually against the balcony railing, but his eyes were sharp. Seraphina broke the silence first. "Someone is watching me." Her voice was calm, but Snow could hear the seriousness behind it. Kael nodded slightly. "Your family is becoming too influential." Snow's ears twitched. In the original novel, this was exactly how the tragedy began. Political enemies slowly surrounded the Valemont family. They spread rumors. They created misunderstandings. And eventually, they destroyed everything. Seraphina crossed her arms. "That happens often in noble politics." Kael's gaze darkened slightly. "This time is different." Snow looked between them nervously. Kael continued quietly. "Someone wants to turn you into the villain of the Empire." Snow felt a chill. Just like the novel, Seraphina walked toward the balcony. Her expression remained calm. "Do you know who it is?" Kael shook his head. "Not yet." He looked down at Snow. "But that fox might already know something." Snow froze. Seraphina blinked. "You're suspicious of my fox now." Kael's lips curved faintly. "I suspect everything." Snow growled softly. Kael chuckled. "You really dislike me." Snow turned her head away dramatically. Seraphina sighed. "You two behave like children." Later that night, Kael left the mansion. Snow stayed awake beside Seraphina. Seraphina was reading documents again, but her mind was clearly distracted. After a while, she placed the papers aside and gently picked Snow up. "You caused chaos at the royal garden today." Snow wagged her tail. Seraphina stared at her quietly. "Did you do that because of Lady Lily?" Snow froze. Seraphina sighed softly. "I felt something strange about her." Snow's eyes widened. Seraphina looked out the window again. She was smiling, but it didn't feel genuine. Snow stared at her. "Her instincts are amazing." Seraphina gently stroked Snow's head. "You always try to protect me." Snow felt warmth in her chest. For the first time since arriving in this world, she felt like her efforts were working. Maybe, just maybe, she could really change Seraphina's fate. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the capital, inside a dark noble mansion, several figures sat around a large table. One man spoke coldly. Lady Seraphina continues avoiding the prince. Another man frowned. That shouldn't happen. A woman spoke quietly. The original plan depended on their meeting. The first man tapped his finger on the table, then forced the situation. The room became silent. The woman smiled slightly. If Seraphina won't become the villain naturally. Her eyes gleamed. We will create the villain ourselves. Back at the Valemont estate, Snow suddenly woke up from sleep. Her fox instincts were screaming. Danger! She jumped onto the window. The moonlight revealed the silent garden. At first everything looked normal. But then, Snow saw something moving near the outer wall. A shadow, watching the mansion. Snow's fur stood up. Someone really is watching. Before she could react, a tall figure appeared behind the shadow. Duke Kael. His sword moved quickly. The shadow collapsed instantly. Snow's eyes widened. Kael looked toward the mansion window, directly at Snow. Even from far away, she could see his expression. Cold, dangerous, the ruthless Duke everyone feared. He wiped the blood from his sword calmly. Then he spoke quietly, even though Snow couldn't hear him clearly. But she understood the words from his lips. Don't worry, I'm watching too. Snow slowly relaxed. For the first time, she realized something important. She wasn't the only one trying to protect Seraphina. The most feared man in the Empire was doing the exact same thing. And maybe, just maybe, he had been protecting her long before Snow ever arrived in this world. Chapter 10, The Fox starts investigating the conspiracy. Snow didn't sleep much after the night. She saw the shadow spy near the mansion. Her fox instincts kept whispering the same thing. Something big was moving in the shadows. Early in the morning, Seraphina sat in her study reading political reports while Snow pretended to nap on the desk. But her eyes were slightly open. Watching, listening. Servants moved through the hallway outside the room. Nobles visited the mansion more frequently these days. And Snow noticed something strange. Certain servants seemed nervous. Too nervous. When Seraphina left the study to attend a meeting with her father, Snow quietly jumped down from the desk. Her paws made no sound on the marble floor. A fox was small, silent, perfect for spying. She slipped into the hallway. After following the suspicious scent, she reached the servants' quarters. Two servants were whispering inside a room. Snow hid behind the door. One servant spoke quietly. The nobles want Lady Seraphina to attend the royal hunting festival. The other servant frowned, but she rarely attends those events. That's why they're forcing it. Snow's ears twitched. The royal hunting festival. That event also existed in the original novel. And it was dangerous, because that was where Seraphina would finally meet Prince Adrian, and misunderstandings would begin. The first servant continued speaking. If the prince meets her there, everything will move according to plan. Snow's eyes narrowed. So they're trying to recreate the original story. That meant the enemies of the Valemont family knew something about how events should unfold. Snow quietly slipped away.